Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting us for the first time this evening? All right. Well, you are all welcome, and I hope you follow us and subscribe to our newsletter so that you find out about amazing events such as this one and all the other things that we do, including reading groups and writing workshops. Let's see. I also want to let you guys know that if you don't already, that the Brooklyn Museum has an African fashion exhibit that opens tomorrow. In addition to showcasing fashion, the curators there have pulled together photographs, paintings, and decorative objects from the museum's collections. They've also put together a list of African authors. So after you read Kayode's book, and if you want to keep reading, our library, which we're also a library, will have a curated selection from their list from our collection upstairs, and you can check out books and read more African authors. A couple of housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A, and when it's time for questions, if you're in this room, if you would raise your hand, one of my interns will bring a microphone to you. That's so that the people who are watching on the live stream can hear you as well. And if you're watching on the live stream, you may type your question in the chat at any time. When the event is over, you may purchase copies of And Then He Sang a Lullaby at the bookstore, and then make your way back in here and line up in the center aisle to have your book personalized. Our cafe and bar will be serving until 8:30. They make amazing lemonade, and drinks are not only allowed, but they are encouraged. So now let me introduce our wonderful guest. Roxane Gay's writing appears in Best American Mystery Stories 2014, Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, A Public Space, McSweeney's, Tin House, Oxford American, American Short Fiction, Virginia Quarterly, and many others. She is a contributing writer for the New York Times, an author of the books Haiti, An Untamed State, the New York Times best-selling Bad Feminist, the nationally best-selling Difficult Women, the New York Times best-selling Hunger. She is also author of World of Wakanda for Marvel. She has several books forthcoming and is also at work on television and film projects. She also has a newsletter, The Audacity, and in spring, and now, Roxane Gay Books, an imprint of Grove Atlantic, is launching. So welcome to the launch of Roxane Gay Books as well as Kayode's novel. And of course, Ani Kayode Somtochukwu is an award-winning Nigerian writer and queer liberation activist. His work interrogates themes of queer identity, resistance, and liberation. His writings have appeared in literary magazines across Africa, Europe, Asia, and North America. Please welcome them to the stage.
Wow, a lot of people here tonight. Welcome, New York City. It's great to be here this evening in support of And Then He Sang a Lullaby. When I decided to start an imprint, like all projects that you have no idea what you're getting into, I just wanted to be able to publish incredible books. And I have really been just blessed to be able to read some awesome writing. And this is one such novel. So, Kayode, welcome to Brooklyn.
Yeah, thank you.
How how has the trip been so far?
Um, it's it's been quite a lot. Yeah, first time in America and everything. It's quite nice. I really enjoyed Boston, except the cold, but yeah,
It really was cold in
it
Boston.
was quite
I was
cold.
like, he had two things to say about Boston. The food was unseasoned, and it was very cold. Both are very accurate descriptors of Boston. But we are here in support of his debut novel. And so before we have conversation, I thought it would be wonderful to hear you read from your novel.
So I'm just going to read from the first chapter because I think that that's quite a, kind of sets the stage for what to expect from the book. So, and then he sang a lullaby. Chapter 1. August's mother refused to name him before his birth. There remained this gentleness still to the child growing in her womb, a hushed quality that kept her from pinning her hopes on it. She would not name the baby until it was swimming in her arms. Her daughters did not understand this, or at least Ozamaka and Chinyere did not. The youngest, Peculiar, was too young to understand or not understand. She simply walked in her sister's footsteps and repeated the questions they asked. It wasn't something their mother could explain to them. She did not want them to worry. She herself worried sometimes when her faith faltered. On those occasions, she read herself the letter she'd received from Kaduna, sitting in the darkness of her room. To her right, the curtains drawn as though if she let light fall on the brown paper, it would crumble into dust in her shaking hands. Dearest sister, you will have a son, and it shall not kill you. I dreamt of your blessing. God is always faithful, and his word says, of whose report shall we believe? Have faith. Her sister's letter did not make her heart impervious to her doctor's warning. She still remembered the way he'd pointed at her. Mrs. Akasike, I hope you heard me. Don't try again. Don't at all, at all. You will not survive it. Take care of the ones God has given you. But the letter made her feel as though she had God's very own grace behind her, and with that came a sort of courage, a courage that eluded her husband. I'm afraid, he told her once, his head resting on the roundness of her stomach. They were in the living room, she lying sideways on the couch so that her protruding belly was resting on the cushion. He sitting on the floor in nothing but shorts, rubbing her stomach gently. The children had already retired to their rooms, and an old episode of Checkmate was playing on the TV. She loved his belly rubs and the way his whole face would light up if he felt the baby move. It's just pregnancy, she said, laughing. When he kissed her stomach, rubbed his cheek against the warmth of her belly, she said, God will make a name for himself. I trust in him. August grew up thinking his mother brave, though foolish. It was one of those things he never said aloud. A thought he allowed himself only in the privacy of his own mind. He knew how sad it would make his sisters, how they would repeat it to one another, whispering, making sure their whispers were loud enough for him to hear. Did you hear what August said? Did you hear? Their heads would be shaking morosely from side to side. Sometimes, when August said or did something his sisters thought unacceptable, they told him a story about his mother to make him sufficiently remorseful for what he had done, what she had sacrificed for him to live. August gathered all those stories, nursed them until they were ingrained in him, almost memories of his own. He knew the folds of his mother's skin, the round immunization scar on her right shoulder, the contours and ridges of the stretch marks that danced outwards from her navel in slender lines, even the way her voice broke when she cried. He knew his story too, every bit of it, every detail of every event. He could trace the defiance in his mother's face as she sat in the car, almost 2 months before her due date, trying to breathe deeply and evenly. The more he ruminated on these memories, the more he was enveloped with pangs of incompleteness. And almost something he should feel that he never would. Someone he knew enough to love but never met. She would have been alive were it not for you, he sometimes thought to himself. August was named by the nurse who cared for him the morning he was born. She picked the name for its promising meaning, awe-inspiring, majestic, venerable. But August Akasike at birth was none of those things. Knowing that August's mother had no son and had been told by the doctor not to have more children, the nurse saw him in an almost heavenly light. When she held him, his pale yellow skin thin and scratching, he appeared to her to be the most glorious baby she had ever held in her hands. As dawn approached and the rain thundered heavily outside, August's father was nowhere to be found. The way August's sisters relayed the story of their father's disappearance, the way Ozamaka clicked her tongue and Chinyere sighed, we waited and waited and waited for him. August could have sworn he knew, even as a baby, that he had been abandoned. Stories had that effect on him. They possessed him over and over until they stopped being mere stories, and his mind drew up urgency and emotions and tears. By the time he was 7, it was almost impossible for August to imagine that he did not bear conscious witness to them. Each time he saw his father, each time the man refused to look him in the face, August remembered that night, that emptiness of space where his father's body should have stood. Thank you.
Get my little questions together on my phone like a hobo. I do have a printer at home, which, if you're a writer, number one piece of advice, buy a little laser printer, $99, you're good. So, Kayode, every novel has an origin story. And I'm curious, where does And Then He's Saying a Lullaby start?
Yeah. So it's this is quite a long story, but I'll I'll try to compress it. I was working in Port Harcourt, which is so I lived in Enugu at the time, but I moved to Port Harcourt for an internship as part of like industrial training for my degree, and I was working as a medical laboratory assistant in a hospital, and it is a very it's a very mundane job. Most of it is collecting samples and just like recording, people's information. So I mostly, entertained myself by imagining kind of background stories for all the patients, right? Like, maybe, he's going through a divorce, or this person or this person fell in love with someone else, despite the fact that she's married, or things like that. And so there was this day, and it was towards the end of July, right? Because I remember I started writing the book on the 1st of August, so it's 2018, which is kind of where the name also came from. And there was this baby that was born that was kind of kind of had the symptoms, of how I described August when he was first born, uh, jaundice and malnourishment, and quite a lot of complications. And it just got me thinking of how what kind of a backstory also brings us here, also kind of leads us to, well, obviously, I don't know, I don't actually know what happened, but it's just kind of because I am a very imaginative person. And, when I got the idea of August from that, it kind of clicked, right? And it was like, I need to write this book. I definitely need to follow this character, like from babyhood, basically, like to its natural conclusion. And that's kind of that's kind of how August was born.
Wow. So, August was born at a boring job, and who among us have not written a novel at our boring day jobs? So you have this idea for August, and ultimately, this is both a love story and a coming of age story between August and Shagun, who is a very different young man. And so I would love to know how you go from that kernel of an idea into the novel, or at least a version of the novel that we are talking about here today.
Yeah. So my writing is very character driven and also very plot driven at the same time. And I always I didn't, when I started writing August, it wasn't like planned, right? I didn't have a plot plan or a book plan or whatever. I just started writing and, I followed the story where it led me. And eventually it's kind of led me to Shegun, right? Because I feel like, I've seen someone kind of comment that August and Shegun are almost archetypal opposites of each other. And it was a situation where, August was drawn to Shegun specifically because Shegun was so wildly different from him. And, you know, writing Shegun was also very, you know, it it taught me a lot of things about myself, right? Because I also feel like I invested quite a bit of my personal self into Shegun. And as a writer, I actually like invest, there's a little bit of me in all the characters, right? But for Shegun it was quite a bit. And after writing Shegun, when I finished the first draft, because it was a story about August, right? But when I finished the first draft, I realized, this book isn't about just August, right? I realized that Shogun cannot just be a secondary character. Like, this is a protagonist, right? So I had to now go back, just like, I started from babyhood and kind of followed that to August as an adult. I also had to ask myself the hard questions of, okay, so you've written this person as a grown up, but what kind of childhood, what kind of home, what kind of background kind of, creates an adult like this? So I went back and now wrote early chapters about Shegun, and that's how the kind of alternation in the story was created.
Now, I know you wrote the first draft of this novel on paper
Oh, yes.
and then typed it into your phone.
Yes.
And that's dedication and a love for writing that many writers don't have. And so I would love to know, what was your process like in doing that? And did the writing out the novel longhand help you develop it and take it further?
Yes. So it was kind of dedication. I kind of anyway, because it was a situation where I really, 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 really wanted to know what happened to August and what happened to Shegun. And I was so invested in finding out. It wasn't really because it was kind of more, curiosity of like, how did they end, right? And so I come from quite a humble background. I didn't have a laptop. I had at the time, like, I've published short stories. I've, been shortlisted out of, for prizes and stuff. But mostly I write my short stories on a piece of paper and then I type it into my phone. And so when I decided to start working on August, I bought an 80 leaf exercise book, right? And I bought a pen. There's this pen I really liked. It's what's the brand? Leo Smart. Nigeria, people that live in Nigeria would know the brand of the pen. And so I literally just started writing. And my internship was an unpaid internship as well. So it kind of also like made things worse because I didn't even have money to like buy data to kind of access the internet. But thankfully, it was 6 hours a day. So when the rest of the day, I would actually have time to write while like I kept sights of my cousins like with my peripheral vision. Because so long as, with children, so long as you can hear them, they're fine. It's when they're silent that, there's an issue. So, and then after writing, because the writing was kind of very, you, you might want to really do something, but your body has limits, right? So there are times when I would write, and then my hand would start to ache, and I would have to kind of take a break. But I kept at it because I was really invested in the book. And then when I finished that, I would say that's when the real tedious job started because the typing part of it was actually way, way worse than actually writing it. And the uh, uh, um, word apps, when you write when the text starts getting quite long, like past 10, 20,000 words, the apps begin to hang, right? Like you can't really edit much. Like if you scroll too fast, the app will just stop. And you so had to create a different document for every single chapter of the book, right? There were about like 19, 20 chapters in the first draft, and I had to create a different document, and then I had to type and edit each one separately and then kind of compile them together. So it was a very it was tough, but thankfully I kept at it and it paid off. So, yeah.
It did pay off, and it's a lovely, lovely book. And when I first read the novel, it came to me by way of the fellow I was working with at the time, Sinclair, and they wrote a passionate reader report that they had not written about any other manuscript. Everything else was like, you can pass. And this one, they were just effusive. And when I picked it up, I didn't put it down until I got to the end, which does not happen as often as you might think. And I knew instantly that there was something there. And one of the things that I appreciated most was that you didn't hide the political ambitions of the novel. And still, you managed to tell an interesting story. So, I would love to know how you think about balancing political ambition in a novel while also telling a good story.
Yeah. So because I would say I kind of when I started kind of, because I've always written, right? But when I actually started thinking, maybe I should send my story to magazines, right? By the time I got to that process, I was already kind of a known activist, right? So my writing was kind of like an extension of my political work. And it was a situation where um, I really wanted to explore love, right? But I also believe that love like that was quite political, and I knew that I was kind of broaching a character that wasn't usual, right? Because Shegun's character is quite a very political character. Like an average Nigerian student isn't that political, and because of that it can feel like kind of forced, or kind of like it might sometimes you're also unsure of, does this sound too preachy, right? But at the same time I was like, but I'm this political, so I know for a fact that we exist, like I'm not. So it was like, yeah, so I wanted to actually really not kind of hold myself back with the politics, because I feel like the reason I really wanted to write that novel was because I actually wanted to kind of explore the politics of it, right? Because in as much as sometimes we don't really want to think about politics, it affects just so much of our lives. Like we can't really escape it, especially as a queer African, where even your existence in public is quite politicized. Like you could literally just walk out, particularly if you have a divergent like gender expression, right? Where people just look at you and you stand out. And it's just like everything is politicized about your existence. Like you going out, what school you decide to attend, the way you decide to talk to people that are literally, arguing that you should be jailed for life, your tone of responding to them, everything is political. And I thought, you know, if they are going to not care about how political they are, like why should we kind of tone ourselves down in the demands that we're making? Because for me, fiction is about imagination, right? It's about the possibilities that exist. And I believe that, you know, kind of the core uh, uh, purpose of my work as a fiction writer is to kind of tell people that you've been lied to, like a completely different world is possible. I promise you, they are literally lying to you, and that's like what kept pushing me. And I know that there was also like kind of a possibility of it getting preachy, but at the same time, because it was kind of a very, love story, like it was a very, very, very love story, it kind of, made it safer for me to kind of just explore. Because, they might be talking about Cloud Ake and Che Guevara and Kwame Ture, but they're talking about it in the context of, a lover gifting you a book and calling you my dearest comrade. And so, the tenderness really also does shine through. So, yeah.
Now, I know one of the core tenets of your activism is queer liberation and moving beyond just equality or even decriminalization. And so, what does queer liberation look like for you, particularly in the Nigerian context?
Yeah. Um, Queer liberation for me is kind of, again, it goes back to imagination, right? It goes back to us actually not describing our imagination of freedom in the context of our oppressors, or in the context of the oppressive structures that exist, e.g. heterosexuality, cis identity, where this is the default and this is the normal and this is who society centers, right? And in as much as that's true, it doesn't mean that those people are free. So it doesn't really make sense to me for us to imagine our freedom as getting what they have, right? And it's so there's this author, this book I love so much, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, where he basically talks about oppressed people, not really being able to imagine freedom, so much so that they think freedom is being like their oppressor, right? And I think for me that freedom is being able to thrive and being able to have the resources you need to actually thrive, to be able to live in a loving world. And so, because of that, I don't really, you know, the whole LGBT rights activism is kind of very centered on equality, legal equality. And it's like, as a Marxist, legal equality is very much bullshit. It's like the rule. It's kind of like the rule of law, which is like, yeah, under the law, everybody is equal, but you kind of need money to access that equality, right? You kind of need, like, under the law, like everybody, like, let's take America for instance. Let's take well, not America. Let's take let's take specifically like New York, right? Where like, homosexuality has been decriminalized, all this being trans is legal and etc, etc. But it's that doesn't mean that you can just walk into a hospital and demand the gender affirming healthcare that you literally need, right? You need thousands and thousands of dollars to get that. And legal equality doesn't solve that because heterosexual people don't have gender affirming healthcare either. So it's like we have to. It kind of forced me to look, because I come from a very poor family, and so it becomes very clear when you are from a poor family that class is also very important, to how you kind of approach liberation and freedom, right? Because it becomes important for us to understand that this world is already quite oppressive as it is, and not just to us, but even to the people that the oppressive structures are built around, right? I don't want to be, equal to cisgender and heterosexual people because they are not free either. They are also, suffering under poverty and being denied healthcare and being kicked out of their homes and, not having access to schools or having to go into debt to get an education. And those things aren't freedom to me, right? So queer liberation is kind of thinking beyond kind of a liberal equality framework towards a more holistic conception of what it means to be free. So that's why I make it because in Nigeria you just, once you are a man and you support gay rights, it's like gay rights activist, and it's like no, close. Close, but no. So,
One of the things I know that was important to you during the editing process was not having to do cultural translation that would dilute a
Yes.
Nigerian story, and that this is a Nigerian story, and either you are willing to put in the work to understand it or not. So, how did you approach revision with this novel and staying true to what you wanted for the book?
Yes. So, there were kind of two things that I had in mind, which is that one, because I'm a Nigerian and I've lived in Nigeria all my life, there are things I take for granted, right? So I was also kind of open minded, for instance, right? Like, there was an edit where you asked me what's, I think it was school timetable. And I was like, what do people call it in America? Like, because so in Nigeria, there's like in school, there's like a table with like the class you have and the time that the class is supposed to, happen in. And that's just called a timetable, right? So it was kind of like, but also it was something that you could kind of use context clues to, kind of, make it more clearer to someone that is not within the culture. But then at the same time, it was also very important for me that I didn't kind of would I say, edit for a different audience, right? Because in as much as I'm very grateful that my book has found, such enthusiastic kind of readership in the United States and, outside Nigeria, at the end it's a book I wrote specifically for Nigerian queer people, right? And it feels great for other people to enjoy it, but I still want it to be a book written specifically for Nigerian queer people and maybe more generally African queer people. And because it was a labor of love in that way, I wasn't really open to compromise. And so I already kind of knew, a bit about, the sanitization. Like within the Nigerian writing community, there are also people that we joke about, right? That, people that describe Akara as, oh, when he entered and they were eating like a fried bean ball. And it's like, come the fuck on, please. Like, so I was coming in kind of also prepared to fight, right? I already knew Roxane and I was a very big fan of her work. So I kind of also like, well, it's Roxane, so I kind of have a chance. But she was quite gracious about it. She never kind of, pushed back. It was like, if you want it this way, like it's going to be this way. And I feel like that really kind of helped us to, just focus not on like, cultural translation, but kind of refining the book into like the best possible version of what I actually had as a vision when I actually wrote the book. And yeah, thank you so thank you quite a bit
Well,
for that.
it's my pleasure. Now, I know that storytelling is very important, and I'm curious about some of your influences, particularly with regard to Igbo culture and how you use those influences in your writing.
Yes. So Igbo culture is a very oral kind of culture. Like our oral tradition. Like we didn't even quite have a standardized writing system. There was in CBD, but we didn't really like transmit our culture, like our histories in that manner. Our histories were transcribed orally. So it's a culture that very that really centers storytelling, right? And that was a very big part of my upbringing. Like my parents would buy me like collection of like Igbo short stories. Well, not in Igbo, but kind of the same kind of styles with the songs and like the call and answer like setting of the songs and the stories and talking about the wise tortoise and the hare and animals and stuff like that. And I feel like that really ties into like the lyricism that people kind of talk about in my writing, because it's such an important part of the person I am as a writer, in terms of style, in terms of the type of voice that I think my writing has. And yeah, that's I guess that's the end of my answer.
You know, with this story, the ending, I'm not going to give it away for people who haven't read it. The ending is very intense. And I'm curious, how do you know when you've come to the end of the story? And did you always have this specific ending in mind for these two characters?
No, no. So for August, right, I did like when I started, I didn't really know where August was headed at all. And then for Shegun, when I came to Shegun, because Shegun's introduction to the novel kind of really turned it from just a coming of age story of one character to like and a very, very like intense love story. And of course, I'm a I'm a romantic. I love love. Like, I love the hell out of love. So I really, really, really wanted them to end up like totally in love, crush all obstacles, and end up happily ever after. But at the same time, it's also a situation where sometimes the story wants to go where it wants to go, right? And I tried quite a bit to steer the story to exactly what I wanted, right? Particularly because Shegun was such an important and very personal character for me.
Mm.
And I really, really wanted it to kind of go in, oh, this is what I want for you people. And the story kept saying like, nope. So I wrote about three different endings because I was sometimes I'll finish writing it and I'm like this just does not feel true to the story, and then I'll write another one. I'm like, oh, close, but there's still something missing. And then eventually I got to a particular end and thought like, yeah, this is it. And also at the same time, you did also kind of suggest that maybe the scene it ended on isn't really kind of, isn't the perfect scene for it to end on. And I kind of had to give that some thoughts, right? Because I also wanted the story to end, just as powerfully as it has gone through the entire course. I didn't want it to be like, strong, 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 and then adequate, right? So I had to kind of, and thank you so much for, your suggestions and your editorial feedback. That really, really helped me out.
Oh, I'm glad. A lot of times with endings, writers often overwrite the ending, like Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. Like, here are five different endings. And so I was just interested in seeing the ending feel a little more focused. And you got there, which
Thank you.
makes for a very, just a very satisfying read, even if you don't necessarily get everything you might want out of the story. So, this is a question that all writers are asked because people always want to know what's next. Are you working on anything new?
Yes, I am, but it's still very early stages. I'm doing quite a lot of research because I feel like when you read this book, you find that I'm very interested in exploring like political events, right? Because a lot of people my age don't really get the chance to be immersed in their political cultures, right? The people that how did we actually get here, right? The British didn't just leave. There were actual riots and like strikes, and that they were forced out, right? So I feel like it's very important for us to also like really go back and kind of understand the historical processes that brought us here. But because those histories are all in very academic, like historical textbooks, it's, people rarely ever like, I mean, you're not going to buy a book that is 3 times the width of this, was published by the University of Cambridge to just, I mean, I would, but, most people my age wouldn't. And so I love actually exploring, histories like that in very dramatized fashion. So what I'm thinking of working on next is also going to have a historical kind of component to it. So I'm also doing a lot of, historical research. I'm looking through archives and stuff like that. So yeah.
That's great. I'm excited to see what it might become. And what does research look like for you? I clearly you're doing a lot of reading. What else are you looking for? How are you trying to like keep track of it all and then apply it to something eventually? What, yeah, just what does your research process look like? And does research underpin everything you write or just some of what you write?
Um, well, more recently, I do quite a lot of research. I mean, for August, for this book, I did zero research. I did not even have internet while I was writing this book. So but more recently, it's okay. So while I was in Lagos, I got a library membership at this library in Ikeja that had a newspaper archive that stretched all to like the 1970s, right? And it's not really so much research about my characters, it's just kind of getting a feel of what Nigeria was like during that time. Like if you picked up the Tribune, like what story was in front of the paper. And I also, listen to music. That's one thing that always shocks people. But I believe that listening to music from that time also kind of gives you the vibes of, like what were they dancing to in the clubs in the 1980s, right? So, what was playing on the stereo in like 1990 Lagos and stuff like that. So,
Sorry, 1990.
so
Oh. Sorry.
okay, my apologies. Sorry. Full disclosure, I'm 23 years old, so so yeah, that's kind of what I'm kind of doing right now.
Yes.
And the more I do it, the more shape like the story I have in mind kind of takes, right? So
You write across many genres. How do
yes.
you know what genre you want to write in? Or do you know the genre first and then you write? Or do you have an idea and then try and figure out what genre would be best for that piece?
I don't most of the times, and because I'm a very undecisive person. Sometimes I start writing a short story and then I stop because it's like this cannot fit into a short story. This is a novel. And then sometimes because I'm also a very my story is very centered as well on titles. So the title comes first. I can't write an untitled. You know how some authors is like untitled. I just cannot do that. The title, like even if it's a title that will change later on, I definitely need to have a title. And sometimes I start working on a title, and then it's like, actually, this is a poem, not a short story. So it's a lot of or maybe I'm writing something and like this would make way like this would bang more if it was set in the 80s as opposed to the 2010s. And then so I'm always like going back and forth. And this even happens with point of view as well. I've written a story completely in the third person POV and then said actually it should be in the first person POV. And then after doing that, being like, actually, no, it should be in the second person POV. So yeah. But the thing is, like, it also helps for you to read it from, multiple perspectives because then you can see how, maybe when you write something from a second person POV, there are certain aspects that it kind of brings to light than when it's like in a first person or when it's like in a third person. And because my stories are always very, plot driven, when I write it in a first person POV, that also helps me to like slow down a bit and be more like introspective and get into the head of my characters and kind of, you know, so.
I have a question that I like to write. I mean, that I like to ask creative people because I'm always curious. What do you like most about your writing and how you do it?
Huh. That's an interesting question. um, I would say that I've not really given it much thought, but if I had to just answer off the cuff, I would say that what I would say I like most is the way I am unbound when I'm writing, because when being a Nigerian, there's a very it's a very very like brutal type of country where like there's just so much that is out of your hands, right? And there's just so much limitations. There's a limit to basically everything. You can't even let's say you said, oh, I'm going to travel and I want to travel to let's say, Kaduna, or I want to travel. And he's like, should I? I might get kidnapped. Like, and it's an actual possibility of something that could happen. But when you write, you don't have those kind of limitations. You can literally dream as far as as you can, as you're able to, right? So that's like the best part of writing for me, the way I'm just completely unbound when I write. So
Well, I think that's a great place to stop and invite audience members to ask questions. So if you have a question, throw a hand up, and an intern will bring you a microphone.
Hi, congratulations, and thank you so much for being here.
thank you.
On your Instagram page, I did my research, you describe yourself as a queer liberation fighter who's marinated in anti imperialist rage, which feels really relatable. And I was wondering, what role does rage play in your creative process?
Yes, quite a bit, like quite a bit, and it's for me. It kind of goes towards an entitlement to freedom, right? Because I don't approach my political work as, oh, wouldn't it be better if the queer community had this? Like, wouldn't our life be better if we had this? I approach it from, this was literally taken away from us. Like, we are literally being denied something that should rightfully be ours, right? Because when I approach it from that perspective, it helps me understand, or it helps me see, beyond the type of compromises that, quote unquote, reality pushes on you, right? Because a lot of the times when you look at, the crushing like nature of oppression, it's like, I mean, I know I should fight, but is it even worth my time, right? Because if you there's a possibility of fighting and never actually winning, right? And that's a very scary kind of possibility to consider. But when you see it as, why do you take something that is mine? Like, can I fucking have it back? When you look at it from that perspective, then it's a situation of, even if I don't get it back, like, it's still my right and I can always ask for it, right? I don't have to think, well, oh, but 98% of Nigeria support the SSNPA, which is like, the anti-gay law that was recently passed, or, oh, most Nigerians are very fundamentalist Christians or Muslims, or kind of things like that, because those things are true, to be very honest. But the thing is, when you come to the liberation struggle from a point of an entitlement to justice, those things don't stop you. It's like, yes, 98% of Nigerians did support the SSNPA when it was passed in 2014. But I'm just going to keep asking them not to until like they fucking get their acts together. So yeah, it's kind of like that. And with the anti-imperialist part also comes with the way that the US and other Western countries, the way their actions kind of turn where rights in the global South, but particularly in Africa, into a vehicle of imperialism, right? Because then it makes it so that the people that hate queer people can kind of describe their hatred of queer people in terms of national sovereignty, right? There can be like, the United States cannot force like, homosexuality on us. And it looks plausible because the United States is literally threatening to like cut off aid, sanction people. So it does like, and at the same time, the level of, the economic, this is kind of like the more Marxist, I would kind of like analysis, right? The economic aspects of it, right? Like when you introduce something like the SAPs, right? Like that happened in the 80s, or when you kind of force the government to remove subsidies in exchange for like credit and things like that. What it does is that it one creates a lot of religious fundamentalism, because when people continue, it's like Marx said, right? Religion, like, it is the opium of the oppressed. It is the soul of a soulless condition. Like, when your entire life is out of your control, it forces you deeper and deeper and deeper into a fundamentalist level of religion, or of a cultural chauvinism, which in turn like exacerbates queerphobia. Like, many people don't draw that connection, but it's there. So that's kind of why like anti-imperialism is also very central to my politics. So I do hope I answered your question.
Yes.
Wow. I'm sure many people in this room want to buy the book, get it signed, run home and read this book right now. I had a question for Roxane, and that was, Roxane, your experiences as a young writer, how did this inform you wanting to start the Roxane Gay Books imprint, and how did it affect how you approach this?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. I've actually had a very lucky, a very charmed experience with publishing, one that is not the norm. Other than money, uh, which I guess is not so charmed. Um, I've had great editorial experiences. My books have been publicized. I've been sent on tours, and so really it was because I saw how most people are treated by publishing. I saw how many gatekeepers there are. Now, there are a lot of things to say about gatekeeping, but sometimes those gates do exist for a bit of a reason. But I still wanted to reduce the barriers to publication in the ways that I could. And so I decided to start an imprint where every submission gets read, and we accept submissions from unagented writers. And his book came to me unagented at the time. Of course, he has an agent now. And I just allowed myself to believe that great writing can come from any number of different kinds of places and different kinds of writers. And I knew that I wasn't reinventing the wheel or coming up with some like magical way of publishing, but instead I was just trying to publish on a realistic scale with a sort of code of ethics that I was willing to stick to as I thought about the books that I want to help bring into the world. And now here we are, and we'll see how it goes. But so far, it's been a great experience, and Grove Atlantic is a wonderful partner. They publish my fiction, and have for 9 years now. And everyone that works there is caring. They've been there for 100,000 years, and they like know everything about the press. And so your work is in good hands. And my nonfiction is at HarperCollins, and that's also good for me. But it's a very different experience because it's hundreds of thousands of books that are being published every year. Actually, like millions of books are being published a year. And at HarperCollins, you are a tiny fish in a vast ocean. And so it's great to be able to bring writers into a more humane publishing experience, maybe forever or before they jump into the big five, which is a much different thing. There was a question up here, and then in the back.
Um, Hi, my name is Chris. My middle name is Chidozie. I'm an
Oh,
Igbo guy as well.
okay.
I was born in Nigeria. I was born in Aba actually
Oh,
and I grew up there until I was 17, 18, before I moved to the US and then went to college here. So before I even ask my question, I just want to say that I'm so incredibly proud of you and
thank you.
shaken by your presence.
Thank you.
I I I'm stunned. I literally don't have words. I'm so incredibly proud of you and everything that your book stands for, and I feel honored just to be here and listening to you read that first chapter. It moved something in me. My friend and I were both Nigerians, and we were always, because we're both very gay people. Very gay people, and we're constantly talking about the state of the condition of Nigeria and sort of like how that ties into queerness and that intersectionality. There seems to be a lot of friction there. There has been for a long time. So I guess that brings me to my question, which is, how would you describe the state of queer activism in Nigeria today, and where you see it being in 10, 15 years, optimistically?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, you can always count on me to really go the optimistic route. Yeah. So for today, I think that we are it's not good, right? But it's improving, particularly with visibility, right? Because it was a situation where there was quite, some kind of first scene, right? And then 2014 happened and it just went underground completely. But since then, it's been kind of, people have been coming out. There've been an actual, physical queer protest in Nigeria, which I was very proud to be, very honored to be one of the people that kind of organized it. And so, with regards to the state of things in Nigeria, it's very horrible, but when you look at where we are coming from, is you can see like some progress there. And then with regards to where I see it going, I don't think that the strategy or that the where we are currently, the path we are on is working, right? Because the forces we are fighting are basically global, right? Because it's a lot of, you know, uh, uh, queerphobia and anti-blackness and kind of, very fundamentalist religiosity tied to it. And these people have quite a bit of funding, right? They are getting funding from basically everywhere, particularly from US evangelicals. And these US evangelicals, they are not sticking within borders. They're not focusing on Uganda or focusing on Ghana or focusing on, they're just spreading as wildly as they can. Whereas we are fighting, with the limited tool of national movements, right? So if I were to say where I see the movements being in 10 years, I would say that I see it kind of exceeding the national boundaries that it has today into a more continental one, right? Because one, there is better safety in that, right? If it was a situation where, there was a queer protest in Uganda, right? It kind of leaves the community quite exposed. But if the protests took place in, 17 different cities across Africa, then there's more publicity, there's more kind of protection for queer people involved, there's more political impact, do you get that kind of thing? So, and we could also, because there are a few countries in Africa that actually have decriminalized, you know, uh, homosexuality, and also like have limited rights for trans people as well. I'm talking of, South Africa particularly, and Angola, Botswana, etc. And it's not that things are so great there, but it's that they also have a kind of like legal framework that kind of makes them a kind of an easier operating base, right? Which would better serve a more continental world liberation struggle than if we are just fighting within Nigeria or fighting within Ghana or fighting within Uganda. And very, very, because I very much believe that we need to find ways to immediately link up and provide solidarity across borders on the continent. Like Pan-Africanism is very important to my politics, not just because I, think Africa should unite, but because I think it's very politically necessary if you actually want to win liberation given the state of the world right now. Yeah. Thank you.
And we have time for one more question.
Very inspired. Thank you so much. Just a quick question. Are you going to stick with writing in longhand and transcribing to your cell phone, or are you going to switch to a laptop?
So I have a laptop now. But it's kind of, I'm also very used to writing by hand because I've done it like for so long. My first laptop, I got my first laptop in like 2021, kind of. So, and I've been writing like since forever, and actually been writing like, you know, getting published and stuff. I mean, the first prize I was shortlisted for was in 2016, right? And I've been doing, you know, getting into kind of things like that, and it was all by hand. And so I'm very used to writing by hand. And so what I do sometimes is I would write by hand for a bit, and then I would like write on my I write on my phone for a bit. So it's kind of like a mix of both, right? But I still do kind of you know, write by hand a lot because I also kind of feel that there's just a flow, right? Like when it's almost like the story is literally flowing through my fingertips into the page. So yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And if you enjoy cake, we have a beautiful cake to help celebrate Kayode and his book. And it looks like his book. And there's a lot of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out and buy his book. It's amazing.
Yeah,
Yes, thanks
thank
everyone. Go out those back doors to the bookstore to buy your book, and then come back in here to line up for to get